So the story I want to share with you next really comes from how much I loved visiting that part of the country and the history up there. And one of the people, my grandma, maybe because of the life she led, my grandma was fascinated by Baby Doe Tabor. Baby Doe Tabor was the wife of King Tabor, who was the owner of the Matchless Silver Mine, which was in Leadville, Colorado, and which had its rise and its fall. And the legend goes, I don't know how true this is, but the legend goes, and what my grandma always said, is that, you know, the mine rose, they were hugely successful. Baby Doe was a chorus girl that King Tabor married, and she had furs, and they built the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver, and it was just, she was the talk of the town. But then the mine's fortunes declined, and so did the Tabors. King Tabor died, and some legends have it that Baby Doe, in her fur coat, lived in the ruins of the Matchless Mine her final years. Well, my grandma was fascinated by this story, and she would tell it, and so I got fascinated by the whole phenomenon. And then I learned that's an equally kind of odd juxtaposition. The great writer, orator, Oscar Wilde, Irish-born, English entertainer, he did a tour of American mining cities, in the 1880s, in 1882, and he was a smash hit with the miners. They would just pile into the opera house to hear him, because evidently he could not only talk, but he could also drink them all under the table. And so he got their respect both ways. And what I love about the idea came to me for this story, because as we've heard a lot this weekend, we never know the effect we're going to have on somebody when they hear us. You know, when you're up telling a story or being in front of a group, you never know what somebody's going to take away. And I thought to myself, what would it be like for one of those miners to be sitting in that hall and looking up on the stage and seeing and hearing Oscar Wilde holding forth? So this is what came to me. I call the story Wilde Roses. Oh, Daniel, do you think there's going to be a ruckus? There I was, in the front row of the Tabor Opera Hall in Leadville, Colorado, the night that Oscar Wilde was due to speak during his American-speaking tour. Now, I was in the front row with Daniel, my husband, a mining engineer, and the whole front row, the whole first couple of rows were filled with couples like us, the mining engineers and their wives. But behind me, the rest of the seats, all the way up through the balcony, were filled with rough-edged miners. Well, I don't know, Dora, Daniel said, but I think after I saw Mr. Wilde hold court at table down below during supper in the Matchless Mine, I think he can handle anything that happens above ground. So he did go down the mine, he did. King Tabor invited him to dine down in the depths of the mine, and King Tabor was sure that Mr. Wilde would say no, but he assented. And he folded those long limbs of his, he crammed himself into a mining cart, he rode down, down, down into the mine and sat there at table with all the fellas, King Tabor, lit only by the miners' headlamps. I understand it was mostly liquid refreshment that was served. Well, Mr. Wilde did prove that his appetite for spirits more than matches his appetite for art. It's true, and when the rest of the fellas heard that, they said, we have to get a look at this man for ourselves. Oh, there he is. Mr. Wilde stepped out on stage. Hoo-wee! I heard a voice behind me. I need some of them buckles for my boots. Yeah, where'd you get your duds? Shopping in the ladies' department? Mr. Wilde was dressed in a purple sackcloth suit, knee breeches, black silken hose, low shoes with bright buckles, and a frill of lace at each wrist. He seemed unmoved by the cacophony around him as the hall erupted in hoots and catcalls. He simply pulled a long-stemmed white lily from the vase on the stage. It was a signature flower, and he stood as if looking into another world until the noise swelled and then subsided. Then Mr. Wilde seemed to come into himself. His gaze swept the hall. I felt his eyes meet mine, and his voice was clear and strong as he began to speak. He reminded us that art is not a luxury, an accessory, something to take or leave at will, but a very essential of human existence. He quoted Keats and Whitman and said that every human creature, no matter how wretched their existence, longs for something of beauty to remind them that life is more than just endless toil. It's what I try to do for Daniel. Make a home that has some beauty and refuge from the trials of the world. Well, he had us all in the palm of his hand. When he finished speaking, the hall erupted, and men thronged the stage to carry Mr. Wilde off in triumph, leaving the ladies to make our way out on our own. I did so, and as I was leaving the hall, I saw a fellow still sitting in one of the back rows. His eyes were trained on the empty stage, empty save for the vase of white lilies. I recognized the fellow. It was a miner that Daniel often spoke of. "Oh, Bill Sullivan," Daniel would say. "Ah, that fella. He does the work of 3 men below ground and causes the trouble of 12 above. Dora, there is more than once I've had to bail him out after one of the brawls he got into at a tavern that he frequents after his shift." But there was Mr. Sullivan. I was surprised to see him. He was solitary, kept to himself, lived alone in a cabin off the cemetery road. But as I edged by him, his eyes met mine, and I did not wish to snub him. "Mr. Sullivan," I said, "well, do you think Leadville will ever find the kind of beauty that Mr. Wilde espouses?" I spoke in jest, but he answered me quite earnestly. "There's always room for hope, ma'am." His eyes were very bright. The next day, I was at home, and Katie came to fetch me. "Ma'am, there's a person who wants to see you. I put him in the kitchen." I went in the kitchen. It was Mr. Sullivan, standing by the back door. He looked up. "Ma'am?" "Mr. Sullivan, is there something I can help you with?" I wondered, ma'am," he said, "if you knew some of them poems that Mr. Wilde spoke from last night? The one about the lilacs?" "Oh, well, he quoted Keats. Is that the fellow from Chicago?" No, that was Whitman. Wait, I have that volume." I went to Daniel's study and returned with the book. "I'd be happy to lend it to you." He did not take the book or meet my eyes. "Would do me no good, ma'am. Making my name is all the letters I have." I was mortified at my thoughtlessness, and we each stood in our own cocoon of embarrassment. I looked down at my hands, slender, tense around the book, and his, scrubbed clean but still veined black with dirt, creasing his hat over and over. And then some stray shaft of grace fell upon us, for I saw my hands open the book, and I heard my own voice saying, "It has been some time since I've had the pleasure of reading poetry aloud. Will you let me do that?" He gave me a quick, keen glance, then nodded, moved to look out the window as I began to read. "When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star drooped in the eastern sky at night. That was the first of many such visits. The weather was warming, and Mr. Sullivan and I would sit out on the back porch, and the words of Whitman and Keats would spill out into the fresh mountain air. Daniel teased me that, "You have a suitor, Dora." "No, Daniel, I don't feel so. I feel removed, as though I'm some agent of grace, sent to give this staunch and starving creature something that he longs for." "Do the men wag you about his visits?" "Of course they do, Dora. What do you say?" "I tell them that time sharing good verse is time well spent." "Ah, well, but you know the ladies in town think Mr. Sullivan might benefit more if you read to him from the Bible." "Yes, I'm sure they do. Well, we are quite content with Whitman and Keats." "I know you are, Dora. Maybe I'll join you sometime." And so he did. Daniel and I would take turns reading, and then the three of us would talk. Mr. Sullivan would say only, "Goodbye, thank you," when he left. But later, I would find something on the porch, a polished stone or 3 brown eggs, bundle of mountain sage, and I knew they were from him. Well, if that weren't enough for the town gossips, one Saturday, Mr. Sullivan took the train into town and came back laden with brown paper parcels. All the next week, more parcels arrived at the station for him. Well, I was keen to know what enterprise he was undertaking, but shy to ask. And then Sunday, when Daniel and I returned from church, Katie met us. "Well, if you please, Mom, that Sullivan fella's been around. If you can believe it, he wants you to pay a call to him at his cabin after lunch." So after we finished lunch, Daniel and I walked up the cemetery road to Mr. Sullivan's cabin, and we were talking of this and that. It was a beautiful day. But as we turned to take the cutoff down to the cabin, some impulse made us grow silent, and we clasped hands as Mr. Sullivan's cabin came into view, and it looked, as always, it was a weathered board cabin ringed by a rough stone wall, except all the brambles and brush had been cleared away, and instead of the weeds, the whole front yard of the cabin was planted with rose bushes. Fully a dozen rose bushes, green and gray, raising their arms toward the sun, and Mr. Sullivan kneeling in the middle of the mounding dirt around their roots. "Mr. Sullivan, are these your mysterious parcels?" "Oh, they are, ma'am." "Yep, some say it's foolish to try to raise them at this altitude, but the nurseryman down to Denver, he told me they would survive with some careful tending." "Well, no one can fault your efforts," Daniel said. We sat on the stone wall, which was warm in the sun, and Mr. Sullivan served us tea and shortbread. "Mr. Sullivan, why are you so partial to roses?" "My mother loved them. She had them in the old country before they came over, and she could always keep something growing. No matter where we lived, how dingy or dark, she always had a little spot of color in a jar by the sink or a can out by the back porch. She said, a person needs a little bit of color to keep their soul alive." After she died, I came out here hoping for a better life, but then there was the mine, the darkness down below, and the taverns up above, and everything was dark again. But his eyes were resting on the roses, raising their arms toward the sun. But there is more to life than darkness. I remember that now. And I have you and Mr. Wilde to thank. Oh, without thinking, I reached down and covered his hand with mine, and we both blushed fiercely. Daniel was taking off his glasses. Oh, something in my eye. Mr. Sullivan tended his roses, Some didn't survive, but many did. And they bloomed luminous in that clear mountain air. Every bride in Leadville, the day of her wedding, would find a bouquet on her doorstep, live and fragrant in the summer and the spring, dried and crisp in the winter and autumn. And the day after every funeral, a bunch of roses would be laid on the graveside. Daniel was transferred to South America, and we were away from Leadville for many years. In fact, the girl that was a babe in my arms when we left was this high when we returned. And Leadville was much changed from the high times of the Silver Rush. But Daniel went to a meeting at the mine office. I caught up with some friends and heard all the latest news. We had already heard with great sorrow of the death of Mr. Sullivan and many other men in the terrible mine cave-in of 1891. And so after lunch, we drove up the new road to the cemetery to pay our respects. And Daniel and I got out and walked among the gravestones, sadly increased since our last time there. We walked to one section where all the headstones were the same, with the same year of death. Daniel walked among them. Yeah, all these fellas, Dora, they're all from the cave-in. Oh, I can't bear it, I said. That after all that, he should die down there in the darkness. Well, oh, here's his marker, Dora. Here it is. Well, William Francis Sullivan, born 1842, died. Wait a minute. Dora. He died a month after the rest of these fellas did. Dora, they must have got him out. They got him out. I was crying freely now. Dora, come here. There is something you need to see. I walked over and Daniel steadied my shoulders as I looked down at Mr. Sullivan's grave. The stone was simple, the same type as all the rest, with his name, dates of birth and death. But not quite like all the rest. For all around the border of William Sullivan's grave, someone had carved with a careful hand a garland of blossoming roses.